Pretty cool, huh? This is 1/4 inch alder, knotty alder. That is an insert in a shaker style door that we're building for a job we're working on. Throughout the course of my working career, where I have been doing construction as a primary means of making a living, I think my focus has been less on doing things like building jigs of this type and more on trying to find more streamlined ways just to do things in the moment. As I've gotten a little bit older, I found that doing things like building jigs is really helpful in the shop and in so many ways on an ongoing basis. So let me talk to you about this one and show you how we use it. When working in the shop, jigs can come in very handy and certainly save time when doing repetitive kinds of processes. Generally, when I'm gluing up pieces of wood for any number of reasons, I tend to try to get done in the quickest way possible, so that usually involves bar clamps and other types of quick setups to just keep the faces with the glue on them pressed together until they set up. But here I'm thinking of a jig made up of roughly a 2-foot square base piece of melamine and a bunch of other wood runners that, when assembled, will quickly allow me to glue up various pieces of hardwood scraps for other uses. One of the main reasons for this jig is that I hate throwing away any type of hardwood scraps, even very thin pieces that have come off of bandsaw cuts. I want to be able to make use of those pieces by assembling them into larger panels from which I can build boxes or other small projects that would look very cool being made out of hardwood. One difference in what I'm doing as compared to some examples I've seen on YouTube of other woodworkers is that I'm going to use all-thread rod that runs through a threaded bushing in the end rails that will attach to blocks I can tighten against the pieces being glued together. I watched a video by Izzy Swan where he does something similar and uses wedge pieces to put pressure on the glue joints. And that's typically the way I would do something like this when I'm in a hurry and need something that works fairly well. But in this project, I just want to take it a little bit further and give myself something that will be permanent and always available to make glue-ups very easily. So back to my melamine base piece, I'm adding 2 1.5 by 1.5 blocks to each long side of the melamine. Both are attached to the base with screws and serve as blocks that pressure will be applied from to join the glue-up pieces together. Rather than using the wedge approach like I mentioned Izzy did, I'm putting 3 brass bushings in one of the border pieces. I'm setting them so that I have about 5/8 inch space between the bushing and the base once they're installed. Now these bushings will accept a 5/16 threaded rod, which will be what I will use to apply clamping pressure on my glue-ups. You can see that these inserts have pretty coarse threads on the outside which cut into the wood and hold the bushing in place, so you have to experiment a little bit with the size of the pre-drilled hole that you use for the bushing. If it's too small, it's difficult to get the bushing all the way in. If it's too large, obviously the bushing is loose. Even though I used the drill press to drill a straight hole for the bushing, I still had some trouble getting the bushings to go in straight, but ultimately that's not a big problem. It's not really necessary to clamp wood pieces extremely tight, but you just want the pieces of wood pressed together enough to get your glue to squeeze out a little bit. Beyond that, if your jig holds the pieces in place while the glue dries, you're going to be fine. So gluing and screwing the support pieces to the melamine is plenty of strength to give you the clamping pressure you need. Now to begin building the internal structure of this jig between the supports, I'm going to install 5 pieces of wood across the length of the melamine, which are about 5/8 inches thick by 3/4 inches wide. The 2 outside pieces will be square cuts, but I'm going to do something a little different with the 3 interior pieces. I'm going to have my clamp blocks that will press against the material being glued up actually rest on top of the 3 interior pieces of the jig. To keep them in place and help them from potentially wanting to ride up higher in the jig when pressure is applied, I'm cutting a 10-degree bevel on each side of the interior jig pieces, and then we'll match that cut in the blocks for the clamp, so they can slip over the supports, which can then be screwed back in place, and the blocks will only be able to move in a straight line back and forth. I'm installing these inner rails that the clamping blocks are going to be resting on temporarily because I kind of need them in place to figure out the dimensions of the blocks. I'm also countersinking the installation screws so that there's nothing to interfere with the sliding movements of the blocks. So here's the basic idea. 3 independent blocks, each attached to an all-thread rod, that can slide back and forth on these rails to hold pieces that are being glued up together. The thing I need to do now is cut the corresponding 10-degree slot in the blocks to match the profile of the rails. Once the height of the blade is initially adjusted and I ease my way up to the intersection of the pencil lines, then it's just a matter of working my way back to the center of the block by making multiple passes and shifting the block the thickness of the blade with each pass. Then a quick flip of the block to make the other side fit. What this essentially ends up being is a dovetail joint that locks these two pieces together and yet allows the clamping block to move back and forth freely. A little auto paste wax on the runner and the groove of the block helps a lot also. You can see that this will keep the pressure that's being placed on the glue-up pieces consistent. Now what remains to be done is to drill a hole through each of the clamping blocks that is larger than the diameter of the all-thread rods, because these blocks need to be able to spin freely on the rods. But here's where I need to think about this a little, because the blocks need to remain in the same relative position on the all-thread. So that means I'll need to have fixed position stops on either side of the clamping blocks. I'll need to have some washers for that, and of course, the only small ones I have in the shop are the exact size of the all-thread, and reaming them out some turned out to be more of a challenge than I thought. I also rounded the shoulders off the nuts a bit that go into the recessed holes in the blocks to keep them from potentially binding. Some of you may have already been wondering how I was going to deal with how long it would take to twist these all-thread rods into the jig, and beyond that, how big a pain that would be when you're adjusting glue-ups to various sizes. It would take forever to do that by hand. So I'm going to leave an end of the all-thread exposed behind the knobs to be able to stick a screw gun on the end of it and zip it to roughly the position I need for each glue-up, and then only have a few twists and turns of the knob remaining to get the glue-up completed. I'm putting 2 hex nuts and a washer on the all-threads before I install the clamp block. When they are in their final position, they can be simply tightened against each other, and that will create the fixed position for the block when I'm tightening the clamp. After extending the all-thread completely through the block, a washer and single hex nut with the rounded shoulders are added to the end of the rod. This will be inside the recessed hole I drilled earlier. In this case, I'm using this red adhesive to lock the nut that will basically weld the nut to the ends of the all-thread rod. When I loosen the clamp, it's the nut and the washer that will pull the block away from the glued up pieces. As a quick demo, I have 5 2.5-inch pieces of scrap hardwood. 3 are alder and 2 are walnut, and all are about 1/4 of an inch thick. I think using a screw gun to speed up moving the blocks back and forth will be the difference maker in something that will be very useful, as opposed to something that would be a huge pain in the neck to work with. I thought about coming up with some kind of slip nut sort of threaded insert that I could slide the all threads back and forth easily without engaging the threads, but I couldn't come up with anything offhand that wouldn't be expensive or time consuming to produce. And ultimately, I think this configuration with the screw gun is a good solution. The only thing I haven't talked about is the tendency of these pieces to want to bow as the clamps are tightened down on them. I did add some threaded inserts to each side of the jig and cut a couple of pieces of wood with knobs to screw into the inserts, and then simply put an appropriate sized block between the glue up and these hold down pieces to keep the glue up pieces snug against the rails of the jig. When this is not in use, I can screw the knobs with these hold down pieces into the jig, and then they are handy and ready for the next use.